let us carefully examine the official timeline of our modern history. We are confidently told the frozen southern continent was discovered late. In the year 1820, a Russian naval expedition sailed to the edge. Captains Bellingshausen and Lazarev pushed through the dangerous pack ice. They expected to find an open passage or simple islands in the cold water. But instead, their massive wooden ships encountered something impossible. A colossal, monolithic wall of solid ice rising straight out of the ocean. Official textbooks claim this was simply a completely natural ice shelf. But nature does not form perfectly vertical boundaries hundreds of miles long. Look closely at the exact geometric angles recorded in their early sketches. This was not a geological formation, it was an engineered defensive perimeter. Faced with this towering barricade, the brave naval commanders did nothing. They did not send a landing party or attempt to climb the unnatural cliff. They simply mapped the outer edge of the wall and obediently sailed away. The official narrative asks us to accept this timeline without any questions. But the historical record contains a massive, undeniable chronological lie. How can you discover a continent that was already mapped 3 centuries prior? We have highly detailed maritime charts from the 1500s showing it. And on those ancient maps, the entire southern landmass is completely ice-free. The official story collapses right here. The timeline is a fabricated illusion. Let us examine the impossibility of the 16th century cartographers. Official history claims these men simply drew imaginary southern lands, but the Peary race map from 1513 shows the true coastlines. How did a Turkish admiral map a continent hidden under 2 miles of ice? Mainstream academics dismiss this impossible accuracy as pure blind luck. Blind luck does not map the hidden subglacial topography of the continent. In 1531, Orontius Phineas published an even more detailed map. His map clearly displays vast mountain ranges and deep inland river valleys. Rivers require flowing liquid water, which requires a completely warm climate. The placement of the South Pole on his map perfectly matches the modern center. Mainstream science tells us the ice sheet has been there for millions of years. If that is true, how did human beings map the exact shape of the hidden Earth? You cannot map subglacial topography with wooden ships and simple astrolabes. These 16th century cartographers did not independently survey the land. They explicitly stated they were compiling older, fragmented source materials. Those source documents were remnants of the global transit network of Tartaria, a highly advanced civilization that knew every inch of this planet perfectly. And yet, modern historians look at these flawless maps and dismiss them as art. They ask us to believe that the matching topography is a spectacular accident. The pattern repeats with terrifying precision. The southern continent was alive. Before we open the most dangerous vault of all, let us pause for a moment. If you are truly tired of the comfortable lies they feed us in the textbooks, then subscribe to the channel now and join me on this forbidden investigation. In 1587, Urbano Monte created an astonishing masterpiece. It is a massive planisphere showing the entire world in stunning detail. Look specifically at the massive landmass forming the southern perimeter. This is Antarctica, completely free of ice and teeming with complex life. Urbano Monte divided the continent into specific provinces and regions. You can clearly see sophisticated infrastructure and grand port cities. Look at these massive rivers flowing freely from the center to the ocean. Mainstream scholars claim Monte simply hallucinated these precise details. But hallucination does not produce identical cartography across centuries. The Old World understood Antarctica as a central connected transit hub. Ships and airships did not avoid the South Pole. They traveled right through it. They possessed profound knowledge of a world before the catastrophic freeze. What Urbano Monte carefully documented was not a fantasy, it was an inventory. A highly detailed inventory of an advanced civilization that was abruptly erased. By the late 1800s, these maps were locked away in elite private vaults. They needed humanity to believe that the southern land was always dead and frozen. But the true architecture of the Earth was never lost. It was only buried in ice. Let us carefully examine the impossible climate timeline of 1816. Mainstream history calls it the devastating global year without a summer. We are told a distant volcano somehow caused heavy snow to fall in July. But the global climate anomaly of 1816 was not a natural event. The Old World hub of Antarctica had already been frozen decades prior. 1816 was merely the final stage of the Grand Quarantine Protocol. It was the artificial and rapid generation of the monolithic outer ice wall, a defensive perimeter designed to physically lock out surviving humanity. 4 short years later, the Bellingshausen expedition arrived at the shore. They did not find a natural continent. They found an impenetrable barricade. Official journals claim they simply stared at a sheer vertical wall of ice, a wall so unnaturally perfect that they did not even attempt to make a landing. They simply sailed along the artificial perimeter and obediently turned around. How convenient for the New World Order that the door was locked right on time. Nature does not build perfectly vertical ice walls hundreds of feet in the air. That is an engineered barrier, constructed to hide the Old World infrastructure. The flash freeze of the perimeter was a deliberate military denial of access. You cannot erase a continent, but you can build an absolute fortress around it. The year without a summer was just the exhaust of that colossal geoengineering. The door to the Old World was violently slammed shut and permanently frozen. But how do you instantly freeze a continent powered by a thermal energy grid? The Old World thermal stations were easily capable of melting the heavy snow. The freezing of Antarctica was not a defeat by nature. It was an inside job. The monolithic thermal grid of the Old World was systematically sabotaged. You can still see the thermal anomalies on modern deep-penetrating radar scans. Subglacial lakes that refused to freeze, kept liquid by the dormant generators. Perfectly symmetrical mountain peaks that leak residual heat into the cold air. The system was not destroyed. It was simply put into a forced hibernation state. A master kill switch was thrown to allow the ice to rapidly consume the cities. Look at the unnatural geometry of the subglacial caves mapped by modern sonar. They are completely smooth and form perfect right angles deep under the ice. Mainstream geologists call these impossible right angles natural meltwater flow. But meltwater does not hollow out perfect rectangular tunnels through bedrock. These are the vast, dormant ventilation shafts of the silenced thermal engines. The elites of the reset needed the ice to permanently bury the central hub. They couldn't destroy the megastructures, so they weaponized the weather. The continent did not slowly drift into an ice age over millions of long years. It was actively suffocated by turning its own climate control systems against it. The ice is not a geological accident. It is a highly calculated layer of cement. It is a brilliant white sarcophagus keeping the forbidden tech in the dark. Fast forward to 1947, the era of modern military power. The world had just barely survived the most devastating war in its history. Yet, the United States immediately launched a massive military expedition south. Operation Highjump was not a science trip. It was a full naval invasion fleet. They brought 13 ships, combat aircraft, and 4,000 armed Marines. Admiral Richard Byrd was given command of this unprecedented strike force. Why would a scientific meteorological mission require heavy industrial drills? They were not going down there to simply count the local penguin populations. The true classified objective was to physically breach the ice sarcophagus. They established a massive operational base to begin the deep drilling process. They deployed heavy industrial machinery to cut through the solid frozen barrier. Aircraft squadrons scanned the endless white horizon for any thermal anomalies. They were desperately searching for the warm oasis areas mentioned in old texts. And, according to the declassified pilot logs, they actually found exactly that. Vast regions of completely ice-free land containing warm, liquid water lakes. They finally breached the perimeter and located the buried architectural ruins. But then, the official historical narrative suddenly goes completely dark. The massive fleet mysteriously aborted the mission 6 months earlier than planned. They suffered unexplained casualties, abandoned heavy gear, and fled in terror. Admiral Byrd returned home, a changed man, speaking of objects flying pole to pole. The triumphant arrival of the American fleet turned into a total disaster. Declassified logs show they encountered a highly advanced defense mechanism. Entire squadrons of fighter planes were inexplicably lost in the white void. They realized their heavy guns were completely useless against this enemy. The mighty invasion force was forced into a humiliating and rapid retreat. They abandoned millions of dollars of precious heavy equipment on the ice. Admiral Byrd returned to civilization completely shaken by what he had seen. He gave a shocking interview to a popular Chilean newspaper upon his return. He warned of enemy aircraft capable of flying from pole to pole with ease. He spoke of massive unseen lands existing beyond the South Pole boundaries. The Pentagon immediately panicked and initiated total damage control protocols. All further interviews were strictly forbidden by high military command orders. The Admiral was forcibly hospitalized and silenced for the rest of his life. His detailed expedition journals were immediately confiscated by the government. They realized the frozen perimeter was fiercely defended by a superior force. The ruling elites knew they could never conquer the old world hub with weapons. So, they decided to change their strategy from military attack to total secrecy. The global narrative shifted overnight to pretend there was nothing there to see. They launched a massive propaganda campaign about beautiful, harmless penguins. The violent failure of Highjump directly birthed the absolute Antarctic Treaty. The violent failure of Highjump forced the elites to change their strategy. We entered the Cold War era, a time of absolute hostility and deep paranoia. The two superpowers could not agree on absolutely anything on this planet, except for one bizarre anomaly, the 1959 Antarctic Treaty. Suddenly, the bitter enemies united to sign the most absurd treaty in history. They agreed to perfectly protect and share a supposedly useless block of ice. The continent was divided into strict, perfectly maintained military sectors. No independent citizen or corporation is legally allowed to explore freely. All expeditions must be approved by the very governments hiding the truth. They proudly claim that tourism is allowed, but it is a curated illusion. You are carefully restricted to the extreme outer edges of the coastline. If a private vessel attempts to sail further inward, they are intercepted. Heavily armed military cruisers will board your ship and force you to return. The treaty was never designed to protect the fragile environmental wildlife. It was carefully designed to establish a massive, undeniable global quarantine. They maintain a heavy military radar presence across the entire outer edge, an unprecedented level of international coordination masking a single truth. The treaty successfully blinded humanity to the existence of the central hub. It locked the final door and threw away the key, sealing the frozen empire. But despite the treaties and the military blockades, the architecture waits. How exactly does the global system enforce this massive quarantine today? They proudly claim to protect the delicate environment from human harm. But you do not need heavy military frigates to protect a few penguins. Look closely at the vessels patrolling the frozen borders of the Earth. These are completely unmarked military cruisers operating in the dark. If an independent yacht attempts to sail south, it will be intercepted. Unidentified naval officers will board your vessel and seize your logs. You are strictly forbidden from crossing the invisible quarantine line. They proudly advertise that tourism to the frozen continent is allowed. But this permitted tourism is nothing more than a carefully curated lie. You are brought exactly to the outer edges of the Antarctic Peninsula. You take pictures of harmless penguins and chunks of broken glacial ice, but try to walk 20 miles inward from the designated dropping zone. Your approved tour guides will immediately transform into security guards. The interior of the continent remains a strictly prohibited blind spot. Independent flights over the exact center of the ice are utterly banned. GPS systems magically fail or give fake coordinates in the central zone. The environmental protection narrative is a brilliant and flawless shield. If you label a territory as a fragile sanctuary, you never have to explain. The greatest quarantine in human history operates perfectly in plain sight. Let us bring all the scattered pieces of this grand puzzle together. Now, we started with ancient maps showing a green and flourishing continent, a vibrant central hub connecting the old world oceans with massive rivers. Then we witnessed the catastrophic and sudden global freeze of 1816, a deliberate act of sabotage to lock away the advanced thermal technology. They built a monolithic ice perimeter to permanently block the survivors. When modern military forces finally tried to breach the frozen sarcophagus, they were brutally repelled by the dormant defense systems of the old world. Retreating in total panic, the elites realized they could not conquer it, so they locked the entire southern hemisphere behind an absolute legal wall, disguising their massive military quarantine as an environmental sanctuary. Antarctica is not the desolate, dead end of the Earth as they teach you. It is the deeply buried heart of the lost global civilization of Tartaria, a central transit point that once generated the energy for the entire grid. The official historical narrative completely collapses under this evidence. You have been lied to about the shape, history, and limits of your reality. The ice is not a product of millions of years of natural geological drift. It is a brilliant, highly effective weapon of mass historical concealment. We are finally standing at the very edge of the greatest lie ever constructed. Theories end here. Now we must calculate the exact metrics of the cover-up. Theories and photographs are compelling, but pure mathematics cannot lie. Let us calculate the absolute physical volume of the frozen sarcophagus, 30 million cubic kilometers of heavy ice artificially suppressing it. Generating this unnatural volume of frozen mass required immense energy. Now, let us analyze the staggering financial cost of the maritime blockade. Maintaining a constant perimeter patrol around the ice is truly expensive. Governments happily burn billions of dollars annually for this operation. No empire spends that level of vast national wealth to guard empty snow. They are actively protecting the single most valuable site on the planet. Now, we must carefully calculate the metrics of institutional documentation. How many original unedited navigational logs from the early expeditions? Hundreds of thousands of critical pages were simply classified or burned. When documents survive the fire, they face the brutal black censorship ink. Let us count the number of independent private scientific research bases. Every single operating station belongs to governments bound by the treaty. They effectively transformed an entire continent into a closed military base. Let us look at the vast difference between the mapped and unmapped sectors. The cost of this operation is paid with the deliberate erasure of our past. These numbers expose the most extensive and expensive cover-up in existence. But analytics alone cannot answer the single most terrifying final question. Let us examine the final and most terrifying metric of this grand illusion. Less than 1/1000th of a single percent has been seen by civilian eyes. Everything you think you know about this continent is a fabricated illusion. We are trapped in a conceptual prison, carefully designed by the elites. But what happens when the artificial ice finally begins to melt and fade away? Beneath the fractured ice, the colossal ancient architecture patiently waits. Entire megalithic port cities are slowly emerging from their frozen dark tombs. The global transit grid of the old world is no longer a hidden academic myth. We now understand that the ice was never an act of random geological evolution. It is the most sophisticated and highly successful cover-up in human history. But a frozen sarcophagus of this magnitude cannot remain hidden forever. Naval blockades and strict no-fly zones will ultimately fail to contain it. We must prepare ourselves to face the monumental ruins of our own erased past. The awakening of the southern hub entirely destroys the academic timeline. We must unlearn absolutely everything and rebuild our knowledge from scratch. But this profound revelation leads us to a much darker and terrifying truth. The ice is merely a symptom. The military blockade is just an executive tool. The truly terrifying question is not what Byrd found under the thick ice. We know that the magnificent old world was actively destroyed and buried deep. The ultimate question is not what lies under the ice. Who locked the heavy door?